On the night of November 14th, 1942, a massive American battleship went dark. Every light extinguished, every radar screen went blank. Plunging through hostile waters off Guadalcanal, the USS South Dakota became blind, deaf and helpless, just as 27 Japanese shells tore into her superstructure. For reasons the Navy would only whisper about, the press called her Battleship X and credited her with victories she didn't win. But the real story of the South Dakota, cramped, unlucky and battered beyond recognition, is far more remarkable than the propaganda ever suggested. The South Dakota was born from compromise. When Congress authorized her construction in 1939, the Washington Naval Treaty System was collapsing, and naval architects finally had permission to mount 16-inch guns on American battleships. But congressional penny pinchers refused to authorize ships larger than 35,000 tons, forcing designers to cram massive firepower and heavy armor into a hull that was simply too small. The result was a ship that displaced nearly 45,000 tons, fully loaded, but felt like a sardine can to her two 500-man wartime crew. Every space was contested, every compartment overflowing with equipment and men. When she slid down the ways at Camden, New Jersey on June 7, 1941, she was already obsolete in one critical way. She was too cramped for modern war. The ship, commissioned on March 20, 1942, under Captain Thomas Lee Gatch, just as the Pacific War entered its desperate phase. After abbreviated shakedown training, Admiral Ernest King made a fateful decision in August: send the South Dakota and her sister Washington to reinforce the battered American forces at Guadalcanal. The Japanese had savaged the US Navy at Savo Island, and fresh battleships were desperately needed. The South Dakota's first combat deployment nearly ended before it began. On September 6th, while navigating the Lehigh Passage near Tongatapu, she struck an uncharted reef that ripped a 150-foot gash in her hull. Limping to Pearl Harbor with temporary patches, she spent 3 weeks in dry dock time. The Guadalcanal campaign could ill afford. Repairs completed, South Dakota joined Task Force 16 on October 14th, steaming toward the Santa Cruz Islands to intercept a Japanese carrier force. On October 26th, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted the American fleet, and both sides launched massive airstrikes. South Dakota's crew manned their battle stations as wave after wave of Japanese aircraft bore down on the task force. Her anti-aircraft guns roared continuously, 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikons, and 5-inch dual-purpose guns, creating an impenetrable curtain of fire. Then at 11:48, a formation of Nakajima torpedo bombers singled her out. The ship heeled hard, evading torpedoes that churned past her hull. Minutes later, HE dive bombers screamed down from above. One bomb struck the roof of Turret 2. The explosion sent Captain Gatch standing on the bridge wing to spot attackers flying into a bulkhead. He was knocked unconscious. 2 men died instantly. 50 more were wounded. The bomb had gouged the gun barrels so deeply that the Bureau of Ordnance later declared them unfit to fire. South Dakota had been in combat for 1 day, and already 2 of her 9 main battery guns were disabled. The crew claimed 26 enemy aircraft shot down. The actual number was 13 shared among all ships in the task force. But the 20mm guns, small and easily aimed, had accounted for most of the kills. The bigger weapons couldn't track targets through the low clouds. Still, the press seized on South Dakota's action, and the legend of Battleship X began to grow. 3 weeks later came the test that would define the South Dakota's war. On November 13th, Admiral William Halsey detached the South Dakota and Washington with 4 destroyers to intercept a Japanese bombardment force approaching Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral Willis Lee commanded the small task force 2 battleships that had barely worked together and had almost no experience with night surface combat. Shortly before midnight on November 14th, Washington's radar detected Japanese destroyers. At 23:17, the American battleships opened fire. South Dakota engaged with just 4 of her 6 forward guns. The damaged barrels from Santa Cruz left turret 2 half disabled. Then disaster struck. An electrical failure in the switchboard room knocked out all power. Radar screens went black, gun directors failed, fire control systems died. For critical minutes, the South Dakota was blind. When power returned, the tactical situation had collapsed. American destroyers were burning wrecks, their fires backlighting the South Dakota like a stage spotlight. Every Japanese ship could see her. At 23:40, she fired her rear turret at targets ahead, but the muzzle blast ignited her own Kingfisher floatplanes. A second salvo blew 2 burning aircraft overboard. Then the gun's shockwaves caused another electrical failure. 5 minutes without gunnery radar. 5 minutes of vulnerability. When her systems came back online, the South Dakota's radar screens showed Japanese ships directly ahead at point-blank range. She had inadvertently closed to 5,000 yards of Admiral Nobutake Kondo's main force, the battleship Kirishima heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, and a screen of destroyers. Japanese searchlights snapped on, illuminating the American battleship. Then every Japanese gun opened fire. 27 hits in rapid succession. A 14-inch shell from Kirishima struck turret 3, damaging the training gear, but failing to penetrate the 18-inch armor. Medium-caliber shells from cruisers and destroyers riddled the superstructure. Radar sets exploded. Radio equipment was destroyed. Fire control systems were smashed. The ship was deaf, dumb, blind, and impotent, as Admiral Lee later reported. 40 men died. 180 were wounded. But the South Dakota's ordeal saved the battle. While Japanese guns concentrated on the illuminated American battleship, Washington maneuvered undetected into perfect firing position. Her radar-directed main battery demolished Kirishima, firing 9 salvos that destroyed 2 turrets holed the Japanese ship below the waterline and started uncontrollable fires. Kirishima would sink by morning. Kondo, shocked by the sudden reversal, broke off the attack. Unable to communicate with his radios destroyed, Captain Gatch turned south and disengaged at 27 knots. By 2 a.m., he had restored radio contact with Washington and reported his ship's condition. Lee ordered him to withdraw at high speed. Among the wounded was 12-year-old Calvin Graham, who had lied about his age to enlist the youngest American to fight in World War II. The ship had taken a tremendous beating, but her thick armor had saved her from catastrophic damage. Minor flooding caused a 3/4-degree list, quickly corrected. By 9 a.m., South Dakota had rejoined Washington to withdraw from the combat zone. The Navy awarded South Dakota the Navy Unit Commendation, but something strange happened in the aftermath. The press, carefully managed by Navy public relations officers, credited South Dakota with the victory. Washington, which had actually destroyed Kirishima, went unmentioned. Battleship X became a household name, while the real hero remained anonymous. Security concerns drove the deception, but the truth was more complicated. The Navy needed heroes, and the battered South Dakota, despite her poor performance, fit the narrative better than the methodical destruction carried out by Washington's radar-directed guns. After extensive repairs in Brooklyn, through early 1943, South Dakota was sent to reinforce the British home fleet. For 3 months, she escorted Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union, protecting them from the German battleships Tirpitz and Scharnhorst, and the heavy cruiser squadron that menaced the northern routes. The Germans never sortied to challenge the convoys, and in August 1943, South Dakota returned to the Pacific. Her role in the Pacific War changed fundamentally. No longer a surface combatant hunting enemy battleships, South Dakota became a floating anti-aircraft battery assigned to protect the fast carrier task forces that dominated the Pacific campaign. Her heavy Bofors and Oerlikon guns and her 5-inch dual-purpose battery made her invaluable for fleet air defense. Through late 1943 and into 1944, she participated in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns, the raids on Truk, and the bombardment of Nauru, always screening the carriers from Japanese air attack. The Mariana Islands campaign in June 1944 brought South Dakota into the Battle of the Philippine Sea, history's greatest carrier battle. On June 19th, as Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet launched massive airstrikes against the American carriers, South Dakota's radar tracked incoming aircraft. At 10:49, a Yokosuka dive bomber broke through the combat air patrol and scored a direct hit with a 500-pound bomb. The blast tore an 8 by 10-foot hole in the deck, destroyed a 40mm mount, and killed 24 men while wounding 27 more. The ship claimed to have shot down the bomber, but observers on the Alabama reported the plane escaped. The battle raged throughout the day. South Dakota's guns drove off subsequent attacks, but American aircrews inflicted the real damage, destroying hundreds of Japanese aircraft in what pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and crippling Ozawa's carrier fleet. South Dakota had been hit again, but again, her armor had prevented catastrophic damage. Through the summer and fall of 1944, South Dakota supported the Philippines campaign. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October, Admiral Halsey ordered the fast battleships north to pursue the Japanese carrier force, now a decoy lacking sufficient aircraft to pose a real threat. While South Dakota and 5 other battleships steamed north with the carriers, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force passed through San Bernardino Strait and attacked the invasion fleet off Samar. Desperate calls for help reached Halsey, who ordered the battleships south, but delays in refueling destroyers and the sheer distance meant they arrived too late to intercept Kurita's retreating force. Historians have speculated that had the battleships been detached promptly, their superior radar-directed gunnery could have destroyed Kurita's ships in the strait. The final phase of the war transformed South Dakota once more from fleet defender to shore bombarder. On July 14, 1945, she joined Task Unit 38.8.1 in shelling the Kamaishi steelworks on Honshu, the first time capital ships had bombarded the Japanese home islands. Despite difficult terrain that made observation nearly impossible, the battleships inflicted significant damage on the industrial facility. South Dakota bombarded Hamamatsu on July 29th and returned to Kamaishi on August 9th, just days before Japan surrendered. On August 15th, while South Dakota's crew prepared for another day of carrier operations, word came through Japan had agreed to unconditional surrender. Aircraft already launched were recalled. At 6:58 a.m., South Dakota received orders to cease offensive operations. Some Japanese aircraft not informed of the surrender attacked the fleet later that day, but all were shot down by combat air patrol fighters. On August 27th, South Dakota steamed into Sagami Bay as part of the occupation force. 2 days later, she anchored in Tokyo Bay. Admiral Chester Nimitz came aboard that afternoon. On September 2nd, he transferred to the battleship Missouri for the formal surrender ceremony. South Dakota served as Admiral Halsey's flagship during the initial occupation before departing for the United States on September 20th. South Dakota reached San Francisco on October 27th, 1945, for Navy Day celebrations with Halsey aboard. After 20 months in dry dock and reserve status at Philadelphia, she was decommissioned on January 31st, 1947. For 15 years, she sat in the Atlantic Reserve Fleet, while the Navy considered various modernization plans, adding guided missiles, replacing her main battery, converting her to a missile battleship. All proposals founded on cost. In 1962, she was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register and sold for scrap. But pieces of the South Dakota survive. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a memorial built to the ship's actual dimensions displays her anchor, a 16-inch gun, and a simulated turret. A museum holds her bell sailors' uniforms and other artifacts. Additional relics reside at the National Museum of the United States Navy, including one of her massive screws and a section of her armor plate. The USS South Dakota served for 3 years and 5 months. She earned 13 battle stars. She was hit repeatedly at Santa Cruz, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea. She bombarded enemy positions from Saipan to the Japanese home islands. Her anti-aircraft guns protected carriers during history's greatest naval battles. She was cramped, uncomfortable, and plagued by electrical problems. The press made her a symbol she never quite earned. But through all of it, her armour held her engines, drove her forward, and her crew brought her home. The real story of Battleship X was never about propaganda victories. It was about resilience, a ship that took devastating punishment, kept fighting, and survived when so many others did not. That story, less celebrated but more honest, is the one worth remembering.